Hello. Today we have Gleb Nisovsky with us, and we will talk about the languages that were prevalent in the multilingual Russo-Ottoman Empire. This topic is vividly represented in the Multimedia Museum, New Chronology in Yaroslavl. In the hall, Languages of the Empire, visitors can find out which languages were widespread in the Russo-Ottoman Empire. When the so-called Ancient Latin actually emerged, what language the ancient Etruscans spoke and wrote, when and how Arabic numerals appeared, and why quotes from the Quran are inscribed on Russian weapons and armor from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Gleb Vladimirovich, hello.
Hello.
Gleb Vladimirovich, our viewers and social media followers are asking you to tell us about the languages used in the Russo-Ottoman Empire and how you and Anatoly Fomenko determined that the empire was multilingual.
This is a very interesting question, and we've thought about it a lot. Of course, it's challenging to calculate the answer mathematically. The logic of the new chronology is somewhat different. It's not that we set a task of determining which language was spoken at the time and then solve it using mathematical methods. No, it works differently. With mathematical methods, we arrange events in the correct sequence, including combining many different duplicates of the same events scattered throughout the textbooks of our history. Once these events are correctly ordered and arranged using mathematical methods, stacks of events, or as we call them, layers, emerge. Each era is described by a multitude of different texts that were previously considered descriptions of different events happening at different times and places. With the help of the new chronology, we align them, and now they represent descriptions of the same events, thus combining all these distorted descriptions. We are often asked, the chronicles are written this way, but when you read these chronicles, why do you discard some parts and keep others? Is that fair? I explain that it's not about fairness or unfairness, it's inevitable. Historians also do this because historical material that has come down to us is contradictory. It's not only contradictory between different sources, it's often contradictory within the same source. So, we look at the past through transmission over many hands. Imagine that someone told you about something, but it wasn't an eyewitness, and the information has gone through 10 to 20 different hands. You hear about an event through 20 intermediaries, and you understand perfectly well that it won't be told to you exactly as the eyewitness saw it. Something will be distorted, something will be added, and something will be omitted. So, when we study the past, we also use information that has reached us through complex paths. There's no way to simply take a text, read it, and find out how things were, with every word being accurate. This is not the case. If this were the case, there would be no need for mathematics, no need for the new chronology, and no need for all these methods and the modern mathematical theory. You take an old text, read it, and get to know everything exactly as the eyewitness wrote and described. This isn't just some household document that doesn't convey any information. It's a description of a certain world order at the time, who ruled what they were called, and so on. If we had such a text, then we would definitely know everything. In reality, we might have such texts. The whole of Egypt is covered with a vast number of texts that we can't read, or we can only understand them remotely, meaning we can extract only some distant ideas. This doesn't mean that these texts don't exist. They might exist, but they are written in a way that we don't understand, with characters we can't decipher, in languages we no longer understand, and so on. If we had a text that we could fully comprehend, written by an eyewitness and from that time, then there would be no problems. So, we have to piece all of this together bit by bit. When we compare descriptions of the same events after applying mathematical methods, we start to figure out what's accurate in these descriptions, what's inaccurate, what to keep, and what to discard. This, of course, isn't mathematical work. It's reconstruction work. Therefore, we separate the mathematical basis and the reconstruction work. When reconstructing, we try not to deviate too far from the solid chronological markers we've established, because if we were to go too far, we could go down very different paths and invent various theories. We try not to stray too far, but nonetheless, some things have to be assumed, some things have to be reconstructed. And essentially, this work is similar to what conventional historians do. It's just that we have different guiding stars. Our guiding star is the new chronology, which allows us to arrange historical material in a specific order and then interpret it, dictating certain ideas about what's correct, what's incorrect, what should be discarded, and what should be retained. For historians, their guiding star is the Scaliger-Petavius chronology. Looking at it, they approach the same material but interpret it differently according to their general understanding. They also discard some things. They also have texts that were written by, in their view, ignorant authors who understood nothing, had poor reasoning, and wrote nonsense. There's a lot of that in history. So, they also discard some things and keep others. Of course, in a certain sense it's easier for them. In the sense that their main body of sources, on which they base their work, consists of later texts written based on the Scaligerian chronology. They perfectly align with it. So, they can point to a source and say, "Look, it's absolutely correct." Why? Because they themselves wrote and edited that source, and therefore, it turns out to be correct for them. We don't have that luxury. Because no one edited the sources according to the new chronology. We take the raw source material, so there can be no perfectly accurate sources for us. These are just primary sources. And primary sources only exist from the 17th century onwards. Everything before that is all forgeries. We've written a lot about this too. Why forgeries? It's a whole process to distinguish forgeries from genuine documents, to study the signs of authenticity in genuine documents. It's a lot of work, and we've written a lot on this topic. Once this work is done, a comprehensive picture of the world's development emerges. This overall picture naturally dictates attitudes towards languages. Subsequently, some other ideas about languages and their development naturally follow from it, compared to the concepts accepted today.
Gleb Vladimirovich, does your research make it possible to determine which languages appeared earlier and which came later?
What is the perspective of the new chronology? I'll emphasize once again that the empire originated a very long time ago. Perhaps in the 7th-8th centuries. We don't know exactly. We see its development starting around the 11th-12th centuries. The earliest separate zodiacal datings are from the 10th-11th centuries. they are the earliest. In general, numerous datings begin from the 12th–13th centuries. So, according to the new chronology, we see our history in detail from somewhere around the 12th century, sporadically from the 11th century. We don't know what was there before the 10th–11th centuries. We can only make some general guesses. We assume that statehood was being formed during that time. It was formed in the Nile Valley. Initially, they wrote in hieroglyphics. This is the very first language that doesn't fix pronunciation at all. Just as it was in the 19th century in Southeast Asia. The same text was written with the same hieroglyphs. For instance, the Chinese read it one way, and the Japanese read it differently. When they read it, they didn't understand each other because they read it differently. But when they read it, both understood the same meaning. That's how hieroglyphs work. They're not tied to pronunciation, may not be tied. You can read them differently, but the meaning is the same. But that's both a strength and a weakness because hieroglyphs only approximately record meanings. They don't fix it with the precision of a phonetic written language. That's why today historians read hieroglyphs very roughly. They understand the general meaning, something about a burial, but they don't understand the details. And they will not be able to understand the exact meaning of the hieroglyphs. Why? Because their understanding depends on the overall understanding of what is written about. For example, the Japanese hieroglyph, 3 trees. It can mean 3 trees, or it can mean a photographic tripod. It's the same hieroglyph. If it's about photography, it means tripod. But if it's about a forest, it means 3 trees. This is just an approximate example. I want to provide a general idea. This is the complexity of reading hieroglyphs. I'm not saying that historians don't understand anything at all. Of course, they grasp some meaning, but it's not enough. Because they have the wrong overall understanding of what's written there. Therefore, they can't read them correctly. It would be great, of course, to read Egyptian hieroglyphs, which truly represent records of our ancient history. Original records, not rewritten, first-hand accounts. This is a vast amount of historical material to work with. One could delve into it. Obviously, we cannot undertake that. It would require many people and a set goal. But theoretically, it's possible. Moving on. After moving away from hieroglyphs, one of the first scientific languages was the Arabic language. From our perspective, it is one of the earliest. It was developed in the empire, probably during the time when it was still in Egypt. We see many Arabic words in the Church Slavonic Gospels. In the Russian language, there are many Arabic words. For example, nabat is from Arabic naba, which means a toxin to summon. Kadesnik comes from the Arabic kadesu, which means holy. Bayan is the name of the author of the tale of Igor's campaign, and it means, clearly explaining, Bainu. Taz is simply Taz in Arabic, a basin. By the way, there are also reverse borrowings. In the Arabic language, there are borrowings from Russian, which they do not want to admit. The most prominent example is samovar. They still believe that samovar is an ancient Arabic word. If you tell an Arab that samovar is not an Arabic word, he will be offended by you and argue with you. They have topor, an axe, which is from the Russian language. In Arabic, there are individual words borrowed from Russian. However, in the Russian language, there are indeed many words borrowed from Arabic. For example, in the Church Slavonic Gospels, there is the term, Pharisee. Pharisee is a nobleman or a horseman. Harisu means horseman. We know that nobles were called horsemen. For instance, caballero, chevalier, means horseman, derived from the word horse. So, in Rome, the nobility referred to themselves as horsemen. In the Gospels as well, Pharisee means nobleman. They are described as the local nobility, in a sense. Sadducei, which is Sadducees. We know that there are Pharisees and Sadducees. The Sadducees were a certain community. Sadduqa means truthful in Arabic. So, they considered themselves to be truthful. They taught that there was no resurrection of the dead. This is all described in the Gospels, but in the Gospels, it's simply the word Sadducei. It's not translated, but in reality, it has an Arabic meaning. This is an Arabic word, Sadduqa, truthful. There are many other Arabic words as well. The words of Christ on the cross,
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?
At one time, we thought that they were interpreted from Slavic, but it turns out they are of Arabic origin. Eli corresponds to, my God, in the vocative case. Limasa means why, and vakdani means, have you forsaken me? In the Bible there is also translation, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is, the words that are put into the mouth of Christ in the Gospels, spoken by him on the cross, are an Arabic saying. They break down this word differently and try to interpret it somehow, even though it is entirely an Arabic expression.
Gleb Vladimirovich, in your works you write that in the Russo-Ottoman Empire, the Arabic was the language of science. Could you please explain why scholars chose the Arabic language?
Its foundation is based on a clear structure. There are 28 letters. Why 28? Because in order to represent numbers in a non-positional system, you need digits from 1 to 9, digits from 10 to 90, digits from 100 to 900. That's 9 times 3, which makes 27, plus 1 symbol for 1,000. That's 28 characters. In Church Slavonic, it's the same. There are just more letters, including a separate symbol for 1,000. You use 27 letters and 11 additional characters. In total, 28 characters. In the Arabic language, there are exactly 28 letters, and all of them have numerical values. Therefore, it's a structure where the number of letters is adapted to the representation of numbers. It's simply aligned in that way. There are several letters ka, several ze, several letters te. Today, Arabs have filled all these letters with different sounds. They have the regular te, the emphatic te, and they distinguish them very strongly. The regular ka and the emphatic ka are also very different. Today, Arabists believe that this is the correct pronunciation in Arabic. Where is it? It's somewhere in Saudi Arabia. They look for places where they pronounce it correctly in Arabic. What does the correct Arabic pronunciation in Saudi Arabia mean? Imagine what it means. It roughly means that the correct Russian pronunciation is somewhere in the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug. It's roughly the same thing. How was the Islamic world organized in the Middle Ages? They had two centers. The Sunni center in Istanbul and the Shiite center in Isfahan and Tehran, in Persia. Everything else was distant peripheries. In Istanbul, nobody cared about those who rode camels in Saudi Arabia. The head of the Islamic Sunni world was the Padishah, aka the Sultan. Everyone knows that. The Arab Spring began in the late 19th century when they began to break away from Turkey. They were told how the Turks oppressed them. This was Western politics. But in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, in the 18th, and even in the 19th, the Arabs were, in essence, the same as the Chukchi for us. Yes, they are citizens of our country, but they live far away, in some distant provinces. And from the perspective of the imperial authorities, they certainly do not represent the bearers of the correct pronunciation. I myself asked this question in Istanbul. I asked, how come there are so many sounds? You recite the prayers of the Quran in Arabic in the Istanbul mosques, but you don't distinguish these sounds, neither the different ka, nor the different se, nor the different te, that exist in the Arabic language. Even the Persians don't distinguish them. They say them the same way, pronouncing them the same. In Istanbul, they pronounce them the same way. So, from the perspective of modern Arabists, it was the incorrect pronunciation, but it was the pronunciation of the capital. Of course, you could call the correct Russian pronunciation, for example, the way the Chukchi speak Russian. It's a conditional question, but we still believe that the correct pronunciation is the pronunciation of the capital. That's how it has always been. If you adhere to the notion that the correct pronunciation is the pronunciation of the capital, then, of course, the current correct Arabic pronunciation is how it was pronounced in Istanbul. You couldn't distinguish these letters. Even though a few words might have been pronounced the same, they were different in writing, and their meanings were distinct. Modern Bedouin and Arabs, of course, pronounce them completely in a different way, and if you pronounce them the same way, they simply won't understand it. But in Istanbul, they pronounced them the same way. It was the pronunciation of the capital. This is an artificial language, entirely tailored for scientific purposes. What is it based on? There are 28 letters, from which we take 3 letters in a certain sequence to form a root. The root carries a semantic load, meaning, those 3 letters. The sequence of these letters is important. There are 28 multiplied by 28 and multiplied by 28 combinations, that many combinations. Then they are further multiplied by 10 using a special construction. So, from each combination, you can create 10 more. All of this is multiplied by 10, but these are already correct constructions that follow the rules. Thus, 3 letters convey meaning, and there are 10 variants. Then it all fills with some meaning. That is, unlike us, when we want to create a new word, for example, steamship, we see that it floats and moves with steam, and we say, steam walker, meaning something that moves with steam. In the Arabic language, you can't say it that way. You can't create a word from several existing words. If a word doesn't exist in the language, it is created by taking 3 free letters and assigning the meaning you want to create. As a result, every combination has a vast number of different meanings because it was done at different times and independently of each other. One letter combination has a vast number of different meanings, and conversely, many different letter combinations denote the same thing. So, compared to all other languages, there is a vast amount of duplication. But this is very convenient for creating scientific terminology. When you want to create terminology, you can represent a very complex meaning with just 3 letters. Arabic words are not like ours. They can have very complex meanings. So, we have to compose a whole sentence where an Arab would say just one word. It's a language that's very well suited for creating scientific terminology, especially within a particular school. They assigned meaning to these 3-letter combinations and developed their own terminology, which no one else understood. And they worked and wrote within the framework of this school. So, consider who was engaged in science in the Middle Ages. What was science like at all? There is even a concept of Arab science. According to historians, in the Middle Ages, no one was involved in science except for the Arabs. They lived somewhere in Central Asia, and science existed only there. Neither the Europeans nor anyone else was engaged in science, only the Arabs were. If we believe historians and take their point of view, that the Arabic language was created somewhere in a village where people spoke Arabic, and it was a kind of local language, then if a scholar wrote in Arabic, it means he was an Arab. This means it was his spoken language, a profound misconception. Just as today, scientists write in English, but it doesn't mean that English is their native language. Similarly, in the past, if a scholar wrote in Arabic, it doesn't mean that Arabic was his native language. Many different scholars from different countries wrote in Arabic.
Gleb Vladimirovich, why did the Arabic language become the language of the Quran?
Muhammad wanted it that way. He wrote the Quran in Arabic. By the way, in one place in the Quran, he conveys his conversation with those around him. They ask him, "Why did you write it in Arabic and not in another language, like Persian? Why didn't you write it in another language?" And he says, "So what? I wanted to, and I wrote it. I wrote clearly. Why are you asking me?" Such a conversation is right there in the Quran. He wrote it in Arabic. Muhammad, in general, was a proponent and enthusiast of all things archaic. Moreover, he was close to the scientific circles of his time. That's where they came up with Damascus steel. It allowed him to create the Ottoman movement and succeed. Damask steel was created by scholars. Muhammad had to know the Arabic language. Although he himself was of royal descent, he was close to the scientific world. He loved the Arabic language and used it as the basis for the Quran. After that, Arabic became not only the language of science but also, thanks to Muhammad, the language of the Quran. Since it became the language of the Quran, it also became the language of inscriptions on weapons. In other words, with Muhammad's influence, this scientific language, in which scholars wrote, became the language of Islam and the Quran. It was then spread everywhere the Quran was taken. It became the spoken language of many Arabs whom they taught this language. And of course, they eagerly filled it with all these sounds. They always lack consonants. So, they filled it with them. They began pronouncing different ka sounds differently, different z sounds, and so on. That is, maybe it was once that way, but it was forgotten. They were pronounced the same way, and then, when the Arabs were taught, they again filled it all with various consonants. Today, this is considered the literary Arabic pronunciation. In Russia, the study of the Arabic language started in the 19th century. How can it be that the Arabic school started in the 19th century? At the same time, if we look at Russian weapons from the 17th century, they are all inscribed in Arabic. This means that in Russia, they were proficient in Arabic, wrote in it, but then, after a 100-year gap, they had to establish an Arabic school from scratch. So, there is a gap here. If we ask the question, where are the largest number of ancient Arabic manuscripts stored? Specifically, Old Arabic manuscripts, where are they most abundant? Is it in Baghdad or Istanbul? The largest collection of Old Arabic manuscripts is in Russia. The most extensive collection of Old Arabic manuscripts is in St. Petersburg. It was collected from different parts of Russia. No one is working on them. A massive pile of documents just lies there, and no one studies this pile. It's possible to research and make sense of it. Instead, historians claim that when Russians wrote in Arabic, they were simply imitating some beautiful squiggles. This is the view of historians. They simply ignore this vast body of Arabic documents. There are no specialists, no departments dedicated to this. Even if there are Arabic departments, they focus on modern Arabic, the language spoken by Arabs. For example, if you listen to Arabs, according to them, in Egypt, Arabic is spoken incorrectly. They have some awful dialect, almost rural. It's roughly the same as saying that they speak incorrectly in Moscow. and the correct way to speak is somewhere in the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug or somewhere else further away. This is the kind of attitude towards the languages of the empire. Historians have an absolute mess in their heads. They don't understand how languages are structured, where the genuine evidence of antiquity is located, including Russian antiquity, what languages they are written in. They absolutely do not understand this. Perhaps this was done deliberately to avoid studying these documents. Let me show you now. We have many books written about this, but I'll show you again. We once visited the exhibition, 400 Years of the Romanov Dynasty, the beginning of the dynasty. You see, it was in 2013. This exhibition took place at the State Historical Museum in Moscow. Here's the sign. From March 21st to June 30th, 2013. We went to this exhibition, and among other things, there was a ceremonial damask helmet of Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov on display. It's known as the Jericho cap. This is the helmet that Alexei Mikhailovich would wear on particularly significant days when he appeared before the people with his boyars. There were many such celebrations when he would put on the so-called grand set, precious Tsar's attire. It was a special attire. The armor was all inscribed in Arabic, including the helmet. This is a helmet from different angles. This is the Jericho cap. Here it is from the front. Look, its nasal guard goes down and up. When you need to protect your nose, it goes down. There's a screw here. And at the top of the guard, there is an inscription. Let's see what's written there. Here is the inscription at the top of the nasal guard of the Tsar Alexis of Russia. It's read from right to left, from bottom to top. There is no God. Here's the word Muhammad. Do you see? This word Rasul means a messenger. Here's the word Allah, God. And here it's written. Muhammad. My Arabic pronunciation is not good, but nevertheless. That is, there is no God but this God. God is simply without an article. And God Allah with the article al. That is, this God. Conventionally, this is exact translation into Russian. There is no God but this God. Muhammad is a messenger of this God. Usually this is translated like this, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. This is not an exact translation. The literal translation is, there is no God but this God. Muhammad is the messenger of this God. However, this is the famous Arabic phrase, which is considered an expression of Islam. If it is written like this, then it means Islam. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. This is what is conspicuously written above the forehead on the nasal guard of Tsar Alexis's helmet. He proudly wore it in the presence of his boyars, in the presence of ambassadors, including those from the East. How should we understand this? Sure, historians will tell us that in Russia, no one understood anything, and perhaps they just gave him this helmet as a gift. And absolutely everyone in Moscow was illiterate, simple-minded, speaking very basic Russian, and knowledge of foreign languages, especially Oriental ones, was too much for them. But we know that's not the case. I've already given an example that the Moscow ambassadorial order wrote in all languages, predominantly in Oriental languages. Such inscriptions are not only found on the helmet of Tsar Alexis of Russia. There are Arabic inscriptions on all Russian weapons, which are sometimes accompanied by owner's inscriptions in Russian. So, this saber belongs to someone, and it is written in Russian. But all praises to Muhammad and God Allah are written in Arabic on Russian weapons from the 16th to the 18th century. That is, Allah is simply God. Or, more precisely, this God. Not some God, but this God, the one God. Only the owner's inscriptions are written in Russian, and sometimes in Persian. There's a saber belonging to Godunov, and it's written in Persian. In Arabic and Persian. On Godunov's saber, the owner's inscription is in Persian. It's not Boris Fyodorovich, but another Godunov. I don't remember, maybe Dmitry Fyodorovich, written in Persian. This is the only helmet that has survived from Ivan the Terrible. It survived because it was not in Russia. It's also amazing. The only helmet of Ivan the Terrible is not kept in Russia, but in Sweden, in the armory of the Swedish king in Stockholm. Or maybe in Copenhagen. I don't remember where it's kept. But it's not in Russia. Why is there not a single helmet preserved in Russia? Let's take a look at it, and see what's written there. Not so long ago, it was brought to Russia and put on display. I believe the Iranian ambassador noticed what was written there. Here at the bottom, there is the owner's inscription in Russian, stating that it's Ivan the Terrible's helmet. And here, in Arabic, this is Muhammad. Any Arab will look and immediately say that it's written here, Muhammad. This is Allah. So, what's written here? Muhammad, Allah, Muhammad, Allah, Muhammad, Allah, and so on in a circle, alternating between Muhammad and Allah. This is what is written on Ivan the Terrible's helmet. And at the bottom in Russian, the helmet of Prince Ivan Vasilievich.
Вот Магомед. М, Х, вот М кружочек, вот это Х, такая, вот, ну, такая вот как бы. Вот палка и вот такая, вот такой, это Х. Вот это снова М, кружочек, а вот это вот Д, такая скобочка. Магомед. Вот. А вот это А, это Л, Х, а вот это А. Аллах, это вот Х.
It's written a bit artistically, but Muhammad and Allah are very familiar words to anyone who reads Arabic. Sometimes they write them not very canonically, a little differently than they are usually written. Sometimes not finishing them completely, but they are all understood. That is, the fact that Muhammad, Allah is written here, is understood by anyone who knows Arabic. When this helmet was brought, our historians started saying that, you see, it's written in some ancient scripts, which were deciphered and understood only by the Iranian ambassador due to his knowledge of certain ancient scripts. And here it's written so complex that it's impossible to understand. When we showed it to the first Arab we encountered, he immediately read it. No problem whatsoever. This is, in my opinion, Prince Mstislavski's helmet. It's also all written in Arabic. And not just in Arabic, there are verses from the Quran here. There is praise for Muhammad, very frequent praise for the great hero Ali. Ali's sword is frequently referred to. This double-edged sword of Ali is depicted. And this is all the weaponry of Russian princes from the 16th to the 17th century. This is what it looks like. Here's an inscription as well. Everything is written in Arabic. By the way, if you go to Spain, look at the Arabic inscriptions there. Everything is in Arabic inscriptions there too. Historians tell us that this is because Arabs lived there. They were Muslims, and they wrote in Arabic in Spain. We specifically looked. There is actually not a single mention of Muhammad, not a single mention of Ali. Yes, it's written in Arabic, but Christians also write in Arabic. The Syrian Christians write in Arabic. That's the kind of perspective. You see, just because it's in the Arabic language, it means they are Muslims. That's not the case. And if they are Christians, they were just imitating Arabic letters. It's such a childish perspective on history and historical monuments. If you look at what actually happened, all the Arabic inscriptions on Russian weapons are Quranic. There you find Muhammad, Ali, and all the Quran. But the Spanish Arabic inscriptions are absolutely non-Quranic. There's no Quran mentioned. There is no winner but God. It could just as easily have been written by a Christian. By the way, here's a Syrian icon. It's a Christian icon. The Virgin Mary is depicted here. She holds a scroll in her hand. Everything is written in Arabic. So, I want to emphasize that you shouldn't think that the Arabic language carries the meaning of a particular religious belief. It's just a language. Even Christians can speak it. There are Arabic-speaking Christians. Arabic-speaking Christians refer to God as Allah. That is, when we say God, they say Allah, in exactly the same sense as we do. These are attempts to create different meanings from the same word. Even when translating the Quran, they leave the word Allah without translation. Why? The word Allah is translated as God. That's the translation. When they leave the word without translation, some other God appears. But what other God, if the same Christians also call God Allah? Here it's written in Greek, Mitera Theos, which means Mother of God, and it's written in Arabic, from right to left, Validatum, which means the Mother of God in Arabic. And here, God is Allah. This is a mitre. It's in the vestry of the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. It's a precious stone, a large ruby. Right above the forehead, above the Orthodox cross, there is an inscription scratched on it in Arabic. They tried to erase it, but didn't erase completely. The inscription is in Arabic. God, Allah is mentioned, and someone else, I think, Muhammad as well.
In a week, in our next podcast, we will continue our conversation with Gleb Nosovsky about the languages of the great empire. Hello. Today we have Gleb Nosovsky with us, and we will talk about the languages that were prevalent in the multilingual Russo-Ottoman Empire. This topic is vividly represented in the Multimedia Museum, New Chronology in Yaroslavl. In the hall, Languages of the Empire, visitors can find out which languages were widespread in the Russo-Ottoman Empire. When the so-called Ancient Latin actually emerged, what language the ancient Etruscans spoke and wrote. When and how Arabic numerals appeared. and why quotes from the Quran are inscribed on Russian weapons and armor from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Gleb Vladimirovich, hello.
Hello.
Gleb Vladimirovich, before we continue our conversation about the languages of the empire that we started in our previous podcast, I want to ask you this question. How did languages originate from the perspective of modern philologists?
Philologists believe that all languages were created by some communities of people, so to speak, in a village. The villagers gathered in a certain village and created, let's say, the Church Slavonic language or the Russian language, with its cases, tenses, and endings, such a complex structure. Recently, a book titled, Complete Textbook of Church Slavonic Language was published. Now I'll show it to you so that you can get an idea of what Church Slavonic language is like. Because many people don't have any idea. Look, it's such a thick book. It has 500 pages filled with tables like these. 500 pages of such tables. This language has numerous cases, more than we have. There was even a vocative case. Numerous tenses, many more than in the Russian language. These are the most complex rules that allow you to capture the meaning of what is said. To describe its rules, you need to write 500 pages of text like this. This is the Church Slavonic language. Do you think they could have come up with it in a village, especially in ancient times? Just create such a language? Of course not. That's why languages are divided into natural languages and artificial languages. This is something that philologists do not want to acknowledge. They all think that languages are created in villages, and they go on expeditions to study languages in some villages and think that, in terms of their level, these languages are the same as the Russian language, the Arabic language, or the Greek language. In other words, they put them on the same level. This is completely incorrect.
Gleb Vladimirovich, how were languages created from the perspective of the new chronology?
According to the new chronology, languages are divided into artificial languages created by imperial scholars for specific purposes, and natural languages created by people in villages. Don't think that a language cannot be created in a village. It's entirely possible. And in any village a language will be created, because the ability to create a language for communication is a human ability that distinguishes us from animals. Animals also have a form of language they use to communicate with each other. However, this language is instinctual, if it is not taught. Or if they teach, then in some details. In general, a calf that grows up outside the herd will still moo in the same way. And when it joins the herd, it will communicate in the same manner as if it had grown up within the herd. In contrast, it's different for a human community. An individual doesn't need to create a language for himself, as a person won't communicate with himself. However, if several people find themselves isolated, they will create a language. In fact, there was an experiment conducted in England in the 17th or 18th century by one of the English bishops. I don't remember his name, but it can be found. At the time, they were exploring the question of what the Jewish language was. According to the Bible, there was a Jewish language. Everyone spoke one language, Hebrew, and then they built the Tower of Babel. God punished them for this, destroyed the tower, and mixed the languages. This is the so-called confusion of languages. They all scattered with different languages. That's how the Bible describes the origins of various languages. I believe that in terms of scientific credibility, philologists hold similar views. In the 17th-18th century, this biblical version was seriously considered, and people wanted to understand what the inherent Jewish language was within a person. They imagined it in such a way that just as an animal has an instinct, so a person has a certain language instinctively embedded within humans from birth. And this was the very Jewish language that existed before the confusion of Babylon. However, due to parents teaching their children different languages that emerged after the Tower of Babel, this inherent language was suppressed, and people no longer spoke it. This was the belief during the 17th-18th century. And that is why this experiment was carried out. Several infants were taken, isolated, and not spoken to see what would happen. What was the result of this experiment? They began to speak. In other words, they created a language. They communicated with each other using a language they had spontaneously created. Nobody taught them anything. However, this language was very primitive. Its sounds were borrowed from nature. They heard the mooing of cows, the chirping of birds, and imitated these sounds. From these sounds they heard in their environment, they constructed their own words. So, how is a human structured? The result of this experiment showed that language is not inherently present in a person, and sounds and letters are not inherently present either. What is inherently present is the ability to create a language for communication. However, the sounds are derived from the surrounding environment, much like a parrot does. In this sense, humans do not have innate sounds. We know that all nightingales sing the same way, and calves and cows moo in the same manner. Their sounds are innate. If a calf grows up among nightingales, it will not sing like a nightingale, and vice versa. But a human repeats the sounds that they hear. In this sense, humans are like parrots. But they construct their language from these sounds. Therefore, in early languages, the initial sounds are predominantly consonants, because the entire natural world communicates with consonant sounds. This includes mooing, grunting, coughing, and so on. These initial sounds emerged in the early languages of villages. However, over time, with the rise of states and the rise of the empire, with emergence of various new needs and for some purposes, a need arose to create specialized languages. This was because a large number of tribes were coming together. Each of these tribes spoke its own language. To build a state, a common state language was needed. When science emerged, a scientific language was needed. Today, we have a scientific language, which is English. In the 19th century, for example, the scientific language was German or Latin. In other words, scientists agree on a particular language to communicate with each other. This has always been the case. They may speak different languages, but for scientific research, they use a common language. It was like that before as well. The same applies to the need for a language for diplomacy, a language for sacred writings, and so on. Each language had its own specific requirements. For instance, consider the language of sacred writings. What requirements are placed on the language of sacred writings? Sacred writings need to be written in such a way that our descendants can fully understand them, even when they have forgotten the conventions of the present time. This is because in spoken language, there are many conventions. We speak and understand each other, but we don't fully realize how much our understanding depends on the conventions we have agreed upon or that have become established. We use certain speech patterns in a particular sense. We do not perceive language literally but through certain expressions. When these conventions disappear, if one of our descendants reads one of these expressions, they will not understand it. We all understand it, but they won't. This has been noticed for a long time. Therefore, the most important factor in the languages of sacred writings was to ensure that as few conventions as possible affected the meaning of the language. The language had to be as stable as possible and oriented towards the future, so that our descendants could understand sacred writings just as we understand them today. To achieve this, significant efforts were made, and appropriate languages were created. Church Slavonic is precisely such a language. It is a language specifically created for sacred writings, with a multitude of tenses and an enormous number of grammatical constructions designed to fix meaning. Today, we speak Russian, but this is a simplification of Church Slavonic. We do not use many of its complexities because such a complex language is not necessary for everyday communication. In Russian, we have conventions, but in Church Slavonic, they are minimized or practically absent. Church Slavonic text can be read much like a computer program. The word order in a sentence is flexible, words are linked only by their endings, and meaning can be disentangled. Regardless of how awkward a phrase may be written, as beauty in sentence structure was not a priority, the formal meaning can be disentangled. It may not be a quick read, but the meaning can be unraveled and it will be more or less unambiguous. Therefore, Church Slavonic is the pinnacle of linguistic creativity in the empire, specifically as a language for sacred writings. It is the most complex, the latest, the most advanced, and the most rigid in fixing meaning. And of course, it was not created in a village. It was created for sacred writings. But before it, other simpler languages were created that did not fully meet the requirements, but nevertheless, work was still done in this direction to create sacred languages. In sacred languages such as Church Slavonic, there is absolutely no politeness. You cannot address someone as you plural, because you is a plural form, and everything is very strict there. If there's only one person, then it's just one person. If it's plural form, it's plural. There are no nuances, such as when we address someone as you plural, to express politeness. It is a language for fixing meaning.
Gleb Vladimirovich, why was the Persian language chosen for diplomatic correspondence and diplomatic communication in the empire?
When people correspond by mail, especially people of position, rulers, politeness and expressions of respect take precedence. In such correspondence, the grammatical structures are not of great importance. It's evident that the discussion revolves around the present time because this is diplomatic correspondence. It concerns current events, and there is no room for confusion. Whether it happened in the past or will happen in the future, the focus is on the present. Hence, the number of tenses is reduced to a minimum. The number of verbs is minimized, but expressions of politeness flourish abundantly. Such a language was also created, and that language is Persian. In Persian, there are 60 verbs for the entire language, 2 tenses, and an enormous amount of politeness. The practice of addressing people with the formal you comes from the Persian language. This language was specifically created for a certain purpose, and there is nothing surprising about it, because this is how the empire developed. This is the history of the empire. Arabic was one of the old and original languages. However, with the development of the empire, Persian was invented for diplomatic correspondence. All diplomatic correspondence was conducted in Persian. The Moscow embassy carried out diplomatic correspondence in Persian. There is a book called The Correspondence of Moscow Rulers with Georgian Tsars, or Georgian Tsars with Moscow Rulers. I don't remember the exact title. This is the correspondence of the Georgian Tsars and Georgian princes as well. They corresponded with the Moscow court. These letters date back to the 17th and 18th centuries and make for very interesting reading. The Georgians wrote to Moscow in Greek. There was no Georgian language whatsoever. The Georgian language as we know it today emerged in the letters of a prince of Imereti in the 18th century. Prior to that, Georgian princes wrote in Greek, and their names were of Tatar origin. There was absolutely nothing Georgian there. They wrote to Moscow in Greek, and Moscow responded to them in Persian. This was the correspondence between Moscow and the Georgian nobility. The Georgians wrote to Moscow in Greek, and Moscow replied in Persian. This was in the 17th century, and nearly all the letters from the Moscow embassy were sent in Persian.
Gleb Vladimirovich, when did the separation of languages begin?
In the second half of the 17th century, thanks to the bloody reforms. In our case, it was the schism, and in Istanbul, it was the reforms of Murad the Bloody. They had a sultan who nearly wiped out the entire clergy, even executed the mufti to change their religious beliefs. After that, the form of Islam we know today emerged. It wasn't done casually. It was done by decree. People don't change their faith just like that. It was a bloody affair, knee-deep in blood, both here and in Istanbul. Following this, the Quranic orthodoxy split. On one hand, it was indeed orthodoxy and Christianity, but they regarded Muhammad and Ali as great Christian saints. This is how the Janissaries understood it. Under this banner, the Janissaries conquered a significant part of the world. Then, in the 17th century, one half of the two-headed empire, represented by the double-headed eagle on the coat of arms, headed in one direction, that is, Russia, and the other half went in the opposite direction, Turkey. Essentially, in Istanbul, there was Russian authority. All the Janissaries were Slavs. The Sultan spoke Russian. Even that very same Petavius, one of the founders of Scaliger Petavius chronology, wrote about this. He also had extensive research in geography. Even he wrote that sultans and Janissaries spoke Slavic. Mamluks also spoke Slavic. However, this doesn't contradict the fact that they also spoke Tatar, which is to say, Turkish, like us, and they also wrote in Arabic. These aspects do not conflict with one another, you see? It was similar in Russia. People spoke both Tatar and Slavic, and also wrote and understood Arabic, at least the nobility.
Gleb Vladimirovich, what place did the Russian and Tatar languages hold in the empire?
The Russian language is a simplified form of Church Slavonic. Church Slavonic was a language created in the empire, probably around the 15th century. It represented the pinnacle of imperial linguistic creativity and was designed for sacred writings. Later, it transitioned to the people and was simplified to some extent. We don't have the dual number. We don't have the vocative case, but some remnants remain. For example, we still say Bоже, which is the God in vocative case. We still have the remnants. However, the vocative case as a whole disappeared. Many of the complex constructs in Church Slavonic have been simplified in Russian, and it's a bit loose. Russian is a bit more flexible in comparison to the very rigid Church Slavonic, which does not allow any deviations. We can address formal you. We can break the rules to express some feelings. Church Slavonic is not designed to convey emotions. It's a very rigid system, meant to transmit meaning precisely. This is its main purpose. Of course, it's too rigid for everyday conversation, so it was softened and adapted to create the Russian language. Our ancestors learned it in church during worship services. The spoken language was primarily Tatar. There were various spoken languages. Different tribes in Russia spoke different languages, and there were many of them. However, the primary and most widespread spoken language that reached the status of a state language of communication was Tatar. Even in the 16th century, all Russian people still spoke Tatar. It was the language of the military, the language of communication. Even the Cossacks spoke Tatar until the 20th century. It was their household language. If you remember Leo Tolstoy's novel, The Cossacks, he wrote about the Terek Cossacks who spoke Tatar at home. They were Orthodox Christians, they knew Russian, the language of their faith, but their household language was Tatar. Actually, the Tatars are those whose language of worship was Arabic, which is why they didn't learn Russian. They have learned it now, but previously they didn't because their religious worship was conducted in Arabic. They didn't learn Arabic either. They retained their spoken language, which we also used to speak. That is, our ancestors spoke mostly Tatar. Some listened to religious service in Russian, others in Arabic. But Arabic was used by the nobility and scholars. In the educated society, and among the ruling elite, knowledge of multiple languages was necessary. Actually, like Russian nobles in the 19th century, who knew several languages. The educated classes knew several languages. In fact, knowledge of several languages by the ruling stratum is an old custom, but in the 19th century it was just several languages for communication. In the empire, it wasn't just knowing a few languages for general communication, but rather using different languages for specific purposes. One for one purpose, another for something else, and a third for a different purpose. The differentiation between languages was more organized, but nonetheless, they knew multiple languages, and they were educated accordingly. Then some of these sacred languages became spoken. Persian became a colloquial language in Iran. Church Slavonic, after some simplification, became colloquial in Russia, and Tatar, which was the primary spoken language of our ancestors, remained spoken among Tatars, in Turkey, and many other places where the empire had established its authority. What are our most common languages? Tatar and Russian.
Gleb Vladimirovich, what was the language of intertribal communication in the empire?
The language of intertribal communication in Russia was Tatar. However, the language connected with religious teachings was Church Slavonic. So, people who remained Orthodox eventually switched to the Russian language. Moreover, in Romanov's Russia, the Tatar language was essentially suppressed. The Romanovs created a theory that Russia was conquered by evil Tatars, and they were the ones who caused this division with the Muslim part. Furthermore, these two parts of the empire grew apart. In Istanbul, they orchestrated a massacre and started to exterminate the Russian language, which everyone knew. They sought to eliminate it. Similarly, here, they began to persecute the Tatar language to create a rift. It was a deliberate separation strategy, designed to make different populations and have them fight each other. Languages in the 17th century were used as a means of war between nations. It was intentionally designed this way. In the 17th century, various states emerged, and each state began creating its own language, often by blending local languages with artificial ones. In the 16th century, Latin was also created, along with the Scala-Igerian version of history, as a supposedly ancient language. Latin was mainly constructed from Church Slavonic to write ancient sources according to the fake version of history they had concocted. Latin is an artificial language as well, but it was created for the purpose of propagating a false and incorrect version of history. Latin is a relatively late creation, originating in the late 15th–16th century. Ancient Greek is also of later origin. There is Middle Greek, the language of the Gospels, which nowadays very few people truly understand. They understand the words that are present in the Gospels, but they do not understand those that are not there. There are many inscriptions in this language. This is the language of Byzantium, which was created simultaneously with Church Slavonic. In terms of complexity, it's similar to Church Slavonic. Two languages were created, Church Slavonic in Russia and Greek in Constantinople. They both came from the same school and allowed for word-to-word translation between them. You could translate word for word from Middle Greek to Church Slavonic and vice versa. But Church Slavonic remained as the Russian language, while Middle Greek was forgotten. It has been largely forgotten, and today we only remember what's in the Gospels, but in general it is not well understood.
Gleb Vladimirovich, what happened to the languages of the empire in the 17th century?
From the perspective of the new chronology, this whole issue of languages looks quite different from how it's portrayed in conventional history, where it's turned into a jumble. On the one hand, they made a mess of it, and on the other hand, languages were used to divide people. Starting from the 17th century, languages have been and continue to be used to divide nations. Today, we know very well these examples, when languages are created, and hostility between nations is fueled through language. You speak this way, we speak that way. That's it, we're different nations. Before, we were the same and spoke the same way, but now we speak differently, so we're different. This was done on purpose. It happened specifically in the 17th century when a new world order emerged, and the empire fell apart. In each place, local independent rulers arose, who had previously been imperial officials. Now they became independent and fully legitimate rulers of their territories and could do as they pleased. Previously, they had to obey, and if they did something wrong, they could be beheaded or hanged. As you know, the emperor traveled to his dominions. In Western Europe, many such stories circulated, reflecting the reality of the 16th century. The emperor would visit his dominions, drop in on one of his barons who was oppressing the people. The emperor would receive complaints, and he would hang the baron on the walls of his castle and appoint someone else. The empire was vast, and every local ruler understood that it was unlikely the emperor would visit him. The probability was small, and in principle, he could do as he pleased. But the probability was not zero. The emperor could come, and complaints could be made against him. If anything went wrong, he would be hanged, and someone else would be appointed in his place. This sword of Damocles always hung over them, and they didn't like it at all. So, when the empire fell apart, they were all delighted because they could now do as they pleased and rule as they wanted to. For the people, of course, this was a tragedy because the larger the state, the fewer people in power, and the easier they are to maintain. This is quite understandable. When there's an emperor at the top, one ruler, and he governs a huge state, they don't need much. As for Turkey, it's interesting how people often discuss what an ideally organized state should look like for the well-being of the people. They construct various utopias, like communism and other ideas. In reality, history has seen a state where the people lived well. This state, however, couldn't withstand the competition. It was the Ottoman Empire, where the ultimate power belonged to the Sultan and the Janissaries. Effectively, the Janissaries held the power. These were military men who often met their end on battlefields. In fact, a Janissary's lifespan in active military service was relatively short, around 2 to 3 years. They needed the Sultan to direct them. But in essence, the Janissaries ruled the state. Their attitude towards bureaucrats was very strict. In other words, the Sultan didn't need special laws to execute a bureaucrat. If a bureaucrat displeased the Sultan or someone complained about him, he would simply be strangled. Any bureaucrat. In the meantime, conditions for ordinary people were absolutely fantastic. The tithe was the maximum tax, which very often was reduced or even forgiven. This was the maximum they collected from merchants and the population. That was enough for the Sultan, you see? And very often people were even exempt from taxes. The laws were absolutely strict. In fact, you could take the Sultan to court. The courts and laws were completely impartial. The taxes were ridiculously low. Archaeologists mostly dig up all kinds of rubbish and sewage pits to understand how people lived. They told me that when they dig through different cultural deposits, the richest deposits are always Ottoman. Even archaeologists can see this. The richest deposits are Ottoman. The people lived on Easy Street. But those in power were within very strict boundaries. This led to an imbalance going in the other direction. Bureaucrats were dissatisfied, and even the sultans and the sultan's court were dissatisfied. When a sultan died, the Janissaries gathered and selected the next sultan from among his sons, and to prevent civil wars, the rest were killed. The sultans didn't like this at all. Not to mention the officials, the sultan's family continually sacrificed themselves for the well-being of the people. But if we look at this mathematically, to make as many people as possible happy and levy as few taxes as possible, there were few officials and many people. So, from all mathematical indicators, it was an ideal state. No one had reached this ideal before, and probably no one ever will. Here's your utopia, it already existed. In reality, the organization of society is not that simple. Cruelty always exists, but it can either be concentrated in the upper echelons or directed at the people. Conversely, the government could steal and live as they pleased. There are extremes. One extreme is how it was in the Ottoman Empire when the people were sitting pretty. There was no draft, people didn't go to war. Only the Janissaries fought. People simply lived, followed the laws, and paid some nominal taxes. That's one extreme. However, it was very tough on all the officials at the top, all the way to the very top. We know there are other extremes too, which are also familiar to us. Finding the golden mean isn't so simple. I'm bringing this up for a reason. There were the Ottoman Empire and the Moscow state. They were twin brothers, allies, and were governed by Slavs. In both places, Slavs held the power, in Moscow and Istanbul. Then, when all of this fell apart, the local officials began to divide everything. They started creating independent states. This drastically increased the number of rulers, bureaucrats, and parasites. People's living conditions became much worse, but it improved significantly for the bureaucrats and the ruling classes. Everyone wanted to grab as much as they could, and this immediately sparked civil wars. It wasn't like in the past when only mercenaries fought within the empire. You couldn't force peasants or merchants to fight. Mercenaries fought for a specific fee. But when everything fell apart, these people at the local level had no money to wage war. So, once again, let's understand how the empire was structured. It wasn't like it is today, where borders are sacrosanct, and you must not cross them. There, it was, go ahead and cross if you wish. If you want to conquer your neighbor, go for it, no problem. Start a war and conquer. Just don't force peasants and merchants to fight. Do you have the money? Are you keeping your state in good shape? Is it profitable for you? It is. There are enough people who will fight for you for money. Hire them, go to war, expel your neighbor. No problem, the supreme authority approved of it all. They saw that stagnation meant death. In any system, stagnation means death. Movement is life. And it was organized in such a way that the strong absorbed the weak. If someone managed his province well, it was profitable, and he had the right to power. He could hire an army and go against his neighbor, expelling him. All of this was approved by the central government, and the population got new management. No one was forced to fight for this. No one was sent to the battlefields. The military fought, and they were paid for it. That was their livelihood. Consequently, everyone was content. The strong absorbed the weak, and the successful absorbed those who governed poorly. That's how it was structured during the empire. It was all managed from the top. And when all of this fell apart, and each of these rulers found himself in his own backyard, they still wanted to expel their neighbors. But now, unlike the previous established rules, there was nothing stopping them from conscripting peasants, merchants, and anyone else. There were no more limitations. They also had little money. They introduced conscription, started minting nominal copper coins, and then began printing paper money. They set people against each other. If previously the military fought for money, which was their livelihood, now people were simply driven to the battlefields for free and started grinding each other down. That's what happened in the 17th century. What did they need in order to do this? They needed an ideology. People weren't fighting for money anymore. They were fighting for their homeland. They needed to explain why they should fight and kill people just like themselves so that John would rule over them, not James. For this purpose, they needed to create different languages. It was one of the tactics. You speak one language, they speak another. That's it, you're different, they're foreigners. You're fighting for your language, your country. That's why these languages were created. Starting in the 17th century, when the world changed, and when everyone started fighting against everyone, it became a political necessity. Consequently, if in the times of the empire, dozens or sometimes thousands fought, now there were hundreds of thousands, even millions. All these crowds began to grind each other down like cannon fodder. Wars began. The entire 17th century, constant wars. The 18th century, constant wars. In the 19th century, it calmed down a bit, but then the 20th century came, when everyone was fighting against everyone, everyone for their homeland, and everyone to the death. That's what it led to. Why? Because the languages were already different. This was one of the reasons. They came up with many other reasons for this. But one of the reasons was different languages, as a cause for warfare. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. I'm not making judgments here. But I want people to understand how it was, how it has become now, and how it might be in the future. You need to know your history.
Gleb Vladimirovich, thank you very much for this discussion and for the interesting story.
You're welcome. It was very nice to see you. I invite everyone to the New Chronology Museum. A wonderful museum, as good as it gets. It was well done right from the get-go. And then during this year, there were few people due to the pandemic, coronavirus, and so on. Although there were few visitors, the museum did not waste time. During this time, a lot has been done and reworked. Maybe if there were crowds, it would have been more difficult. But this time was used very effectively, and the museum has greatly improved. There's a lot of new and interesting things. I invite everyone to this museum. If you are in Yaroslavl, be sure to visit. And if you can't make it to Yaroslavl, as far as I know, for those who live far away and cannot come to Yaroslavl, the museum is planning to organize some remote tours. That's also a very good thing. And I wholeheartedly support it.
Gleb Vladimirovich, thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
In our next podcast, we will continue the conversation with the founders of the New Chronology about the results of their scientific research. We look forward to seeing you in a week on the channel of the Multimedia Museum of New Chronology. See you soon.